As part of the 47th IBIMA conference, held from June 28 to 30, 2026 in Madrid, this paper entitled, Organizational Performance as a Systemic Construct, aims to challenge a fundamental assumption in management, that organizational performance can be adequately captured through financial metrics alone. Instead, we argue that performance is an emergent and systemic property, and that understanding it requires an entirely different theoretical lens. The remainder of this article is structured as follows. Section 1 presents the foundations of systems thinking. Section 2 analyzes the firm as a complex socio-technical system. Section 3 examines the evolution of performance theories. Section 4 discusses measurement frameworks, and Section 5 proposes a systemic conception of performance and its implications. The world has changed. Organizations today operate in complex and uncertain environments. Globalization, technology, and societal expectations are key drivers. Old models are not enough. Traditional management assumes stability. IT relies on linear and simple cause-effect thinking. But this is no longer sufficient. IT cannot explain today's organizational reality. Performance is an important notion in management. But it is also a debated one. Traditionally, it means financial results and efficiency. Measurable. Objective. Simple. But this is too narrow. This view is limited. Performance is not only financial. It is multidimensional. It depends on context. It depends on stakeholders. It is a social construction. So performance is not fixed. It is an interpretation. This evolution raises a fundamental question. How should organizational performance be understood and assessed in an increasingly complex environment? As organizations face globalization, technological acceleration, uncertainty, and growing societal expectations, the traditional view of performance, centered on financial outcomes and efficiency, becomes increasingly inadequate. The limitations of conventional managerial paradigms, based on stability, linear causality, and reductionist thinking, have led to a renewed understanding of performance. Today, performance is increasingly seen as multidimensional, socially constructed, context-dependent, and continuously evolving. To address the complexity of organizational performance, this paper adopts a systems thinking perspective based on the work of von Bertalanffy, Lemoine, and Checkland. From this perspective, organizations are viewed as open and interconnected systems that continuously interact with their environment. Therefore, organizational performance is not the result of isolated components, but emerges from their interactions, coordination, and capacity to adapt. Key mechanisms: how systems behave. 3 key ideas explain this. Feedback loops. Emergence. Co-evolution. These explain dynamic behavior. Main argument of this paper. Performance is a systemic construct. It emerges from interactions between organization and environment. It is dynamic. It is multidimensional. It is context-dependent. Foundations of systems thinking. The key epistemological break here is von Bertalanffy's shift from analyzing components in isolation to analyzing interaction patterns. Senge extends this by replacing control logic with learning logic, which has direct consequences for how we think about managing performance. From the perspective of organizational performance, these systemic foundations suggest that performance should not be understood as the aggregate outcome of isolated organizational components, but rather as an emergent property arising from the interactions among actors, processes, resources, and their environment. Von Bertalanffy's conception of systems as interacting elements shifts the focus from individual organizational units to the quality of their interrelationships. This perspective is reinforced by de Rosnay's emphasis on system dynamics, Odum's notion of functional coherence, and Lemoine's constructivist framework, which highlights the interdependence of organizational structure, purpose, activities, and evolution. Cheklin's distinction between hard and soft systems further implies that organizational performance depends not only on internal coordination, but also on how organizational boundaries and stakeholder relationships are continuously interpreted, negotiated, and reconfigured in response to changing contexts. Consequently, organizational performance can be conceived as a systemic and dynamic construct that emerges from the organization's capacity to coordinate its interdependent components while continuously adapting to environmental changes. Organizations as complex systems (BIS VSM) is not just a structural model, it's a governance model. The point is that viability emerges from the coordination of 5 subsystems, not from optimizing any one of them. This is incompatible with traditional performance management centered on a single metric. Organizations are open systems that continuously exchange matter, energy, and information with their environment, making them dynamic, adaptive, and context-dependent. This openness challenges linear and deterministic models, emphasizing equifinality, feedback processes, and learning as central mechanisms of organizational behavior. From cybernetics to complexity theory, systems thinking evolves toward viewing organizations as self-organizing, non-linear, and continuously co-evolving systems. Organizations are socio-technical systems where social and technical components are interdependent, and performance emerges from their continuous joint optimization and interaction. They can also be understood as configurations of interrelated subsystems, whose coordinated functioning ensures viability through feedback, adaptation, and distributed control mechanisms. Finally, organizations are open to their environment, co-evolving through continuous exchanges of resources and information, requiring dynamic stability to adapt while maintaining coherence. Traditionally, organizational performance was mainly associated with financial results and measured through objective indicators, such as profitability or productivity. However, this view has been increasingly criticized. Scholars such as Quinn and Rawbaugh, Lemoine, and de la Villanois argue that performance is multidimensional, context-dependent, and cannot be reduced to financial measures alone. These criticisms naturally lead us to adopt a systems thinking perspective, where performance emerges from the interactions within the organization and its environment. Theoretical evolution, Quinn and Rawbaugh's CVF, is the critical turning point. By recognizing that organizations simultaneously operate under competing logics, efficiency and adaptability, stability and flexibility, they destroy the idea of a single universal performance standard. According to Quinn and Rawbaugh, 1983, a concept is an abstraction of observable facts, which are either directly observable or readily measurable. However, some concepts are difficult to link to the phenomena they are supposed to represent. They are inferred at a higher level of abstraction from observed events, and their meaning cannot be easily explained on the basis of particular facts. Such abstractions are sometimes referred to as constructs, as they are built from less abstract concepts. With regard to performance, no one seems able to identify the concepts, such as productivity or capital growth, that should be included in the construct of performance. Quinn and Rawbaugh, 1983. Cited in de la Villanois, 2001, page 2. Organizational performance should be reconceptualized as a systemic construct emerging from interactions between organizational subsystems and their environment, multidimensional, dynamic, and context-dependent, rather than reducible to a single indicator. The cumulative evolution of performance theories and measurement frameworks suggests an epistemological transformation. Performance is increasingly conceived not as a stable and objectively measurable outcome, but as an emergent, context-dependent, and structurally embedded construct.
Global performance extends this approach by integrating economic, social, and environmental dimensions, with frameworks such as the OECD criteria providing a more comprehensive and long-term evaluation perspective. Corporate social responsibility, CSR, represents this systemic vision in practice by viewing the organization as accountable to its stakeholders and focusing on sustainable, multidimensional value creation over time. To move from this conceptual overview to a more analytical perspective, it is necessary to examine how these frameworks operationalize performance measurement in practice and to assess their respective strengths and limitations in capturing organizational complexity. The balanced scorecard broadens performance beyond financial indicators by including multiple dimensions, but it remains limited by a mostly linear view that does not fully capture organizational complexity.
Systems thinking redefines organizational performance as a dynamic and multidimensional process emerging from interactions between internal components and the external environment, rather than as a fixed measurable target. Moen, 1990. Building on B's viable system model and the competing values framework, the text proposes a matrix combining two dimensions: organizational viability, internal coherence, and adaptability, and performance orientation, from efficiency-focused to external adaptability. This matrix, Viability Performance Matrix, is the paper's core contribution. The northeast quadrant, adaptive performance, represents the highest systemic potential, internal coherence combined with environmental responsiveness. Critically, the matrix doesn't prescribe one optimal configuration. It maps the dynamic tensions organizations must continuously navigate. The model combines organizational viability and performance orientation to identify four types of systemic performance. Regulated performance is stable and efficient, but weak in external adaptability. Adaptive performance is the most effective configuration, balancing internal coherence with strong responsiveness to environmental change. Fragmented performance reflects internal inefficiencies and lack of coordination, despite some localized optimization. Reactive performance is externally responsive, but lacks internal stability, threatening long-term sustainability. Overall, the framework shows that performance is not a fixed state, but a continuous balancing process between internal coherence and external adaptation, with managerial implications emphasizing learning, governance, and adaptive tools. Limits and perspectives. The main honest limitation: systemic complexity makes causal relationships harder to pin down, which complicates both empirical measurement and managerial application. The three directions, composite dashboards, structured feedback cycles, and scenario simulations, are not solutions to this problem, but actionable entry points that make complexity more manageable without pretending to eliminate it. Conclusion to close. Systemic performance is not a methodological refinement of financial performance, it's a reconceptualization. Organizations that treat performance as reducible to a single score are operating with a model that cannot handle the complexity they actually face. Managerial implications. 4 concrete shifts follow from reconceptualizing performance as systemic. First, decision-making must account for circular causality. Actions in one subsystem propagate throughout the system. Second, the goal is not static efficiency, but continuous adaptive learning. Third, governance must be distributed across levels, not centralized. Fourth, sustainability is not an add-on, it's a structural performance dimension. Organizations are operating in an increasingly complex environment, shaped by globalization, technological acceleration, uncertainty, and rising societal expectations. In this context, the traditional view of organizational performance, primarily based on financial outcomes and efficiency indicators, has become insufficient. Conventional managerial paradigms rely on assumptions of stability, linear causality, and reductionist analysis, which struggle to capture the complexity of today's organizations. This has led to a renewed understanding of performance as a multidimensional, socially constructed, context-dependent, and dynamic concept. Rather than being a fixed outcome, performance is increasingly viewed as an emergent property resulting from the interactions between the organization and its environment. Shifting landscape treats each of the three forces, globalization, tech acceleration, societal expectations, as an economic and epistemological problem, not just a contextual backdrop. Ends with the article's own phrasing on why traditional paradigms fail structurally. Thank you for your attention.